She had asked for him by name, and every man at the agency thought she was out of her mind. The clerk at Calloway's matrimonial registry had looked up from his ledger twice to make sure he had heard her correctly. He had. Clara Voss, 28 years old, horsebreaker by trade, 5 feet 4 inches, with calluses on both palms, had pointed to the name second from the bottom of the board and said, "That one." Emmett Crane. Emmett was 53. He had been on the board for 11 months. The other men joked, not unkindly, that his listing was decorative at this point, the way a general store keeps a jar of hard candy no one buys anymore, but no one can bring themselves to throw out either. He had a weathered face, a son of 9 named Will, and a ranch outside Harlow, Wyoming, that had been slowly losing the argument against the land for the better part of 3 years. He was the oldest name on the board by a margin that nobody bothered to calculate politely. When the clerk sent word to his ranch, Emmett read the letter twice standing at the kitchen table. Will watched from the doorway, still holding his school primer. "Is it good news?" Will asked. Emmett folded the letter and set it under the salt crock. "Don't know yet." He drove to Harlow the next morning in the wagon with his hat pulled low, and he met Clara Voss in the registry's small waiting room. She was already standing when he came in, which surprised him. She was looking at the window when he entered, and she turned without hurrying. She had dark hair pinned simply and a direct, unhurried quality in her eyes that made him feel, oddly, that she had been expecting him longer than a single morning. "Mr. Crane." She put her hand out the way a man would. He shook it. "Miss Voss." The clerk fluttered somewhere behind them with papers. Neither of them looked at him. The clerk said, "You asked for me specifically." Emmett said, "I did. You want to tell me why?" She considered that for a moment. "My father broke horses on a spread outside Cheyenne until he was 61. He was worth more at 53 than most men are at 25. I'm not afraid of a few years on a man if the years were spent doing the right things." She paused. Were they? It was the most unusual question anyone had put to him in a decade. He thought about it honestly. "Some of them," he said. "I'm still working on the rest." She almost smiled. "That's the right answer." The arrangement they settled on was plain. She would come to the Crane Ranch as housekeeper and cook, with the understanding that if things were agreeable after 60 days, they would speak to the minister in Harlow about making it permanent. Emmett did not believe in dressing up practical arrangements with romantic language. He had been married once, quietly and well, and his wife had died of fever when Will was 4, and that was all there was to say about that. What Will needed was a household that ran. And what Emmett needed was someone steady enough not to blow away in the first hard wind. He told Clara this plainly, sitting across from her in the registry's front room with the November light coming flat through the window. She nodded. "I don't blow away." He believed her. He did not know why. He drove home and told Will that a woman was coming to help around the ranch. And Will listened the way 9-year-old boys listen to their fathers, with his full attention aimed just slightly at the wall beside him. "Is she nice?" Will asked. "I don't know her well enough yet," Emmett said. Will looked at the wall a moment longer. Okay, Clara arrived on a Thursday, which was a practical day to arrive because there was no reason to make a production of it. Emmett hitched the wagon and met the stage in Harlow. She had one trunk and a leather satchel that she carried herself, and she climbed down from the stage without waiting for a hand and stood in the cold November air looking at the mountains the way a person looks at something they intend to understand. On the ride back, they said very little. There was enough wind to make conversation effortful, and neither of them were people who talked over wind. The ranch came into view through the scrub pines. The low main house, the big barn with its new patched roof, the kitchen garden gone to frost stubble, and Clara looked at it without comment, which Emmett appreciated. He had learned to distrust people who spoke too quickly about land they had not worked yet. Will was on the porch when they pulled in. He had put on his good jacket without being asked, which Emmett noted and said nothing about. The boy stood very straight in the cold, watching Clara climb down from the wagon with the same expression he used when something interested him badly, but he didn't want anyone to know it. "Will, this is Miss Voss." "Hello, Will." Clara looked at him straight. The way she looked at everything. "That's a good-looking jacket." Will glanced down at it as though seeing it for the first time. "It was my dad's when he was a kid. Ma took it in." There was the briefest pause, the kind that opens around a dead woman's name without anyone meaning it to. "She did good work," Clara said simply, and went in through the door. Will watched her go. Then he looked at Emmett with something careful in his face. Emmett picked up her trunk. "Take the satchel." The boy did, without argument. The first week was a study in the distance between two careful people. Emmett rose before dawn and was out to the barn before Clara had the stove lit, and he came in for meals and ate with steady efficiency and went back out. He was not cold. He was a man who had learned to live at the far edge of warmth and stay there, where things were easier to keep. Clara seemed to understand this. She did not attempt to fill the silences at the table. She kept the kitchen in a running order that was different from the order it had been in before, things in better places, the pantry reorganized by how often something was needed, and Emmett noticed, but said nothing. The food was good. Not fancy. Good. Will watched her constantly, from a respectful distance the way he watched the horses. On the 5th day, Clara came in from the kitchen garden at midday and found the table already set for 3. She stopped at the door. The plates were in the right places, the cups filled with water, the bread sliced and on the board. Will was sitting at his place with his primer open, not looking at her. She hung her coat on the peg by the door. She pulled out her chair and sat down. "Thank you," she said to the room. Will turned a page of his primer. "The bread was going to get cold," he said, in a tone that explained everything and nothing. She did not make more of it than that. She poured herself water and reached for the bread, and they ate together in the way they had been eating, quietly, separately, except that it was not entirely separate anymore. And they both knew it, and neither said so. Emmett came in 10 minutes late, his coat still on. He looked at the table, at the empty breadboard, at Will already eating. He sat down. He poured himself water. He looked at Clara once, briefly, as though reading something. He served himself from the pot. The second week, the pump in the south pasture froze. Emmett discovered it at first light and came back in with the look he wore when something had gone badly wrong that he had been half expecting. He stood at the kitchen doorway, not quite coming in, and told Clara there would be no water in the south barn for the horses until he could get the pipe clear, and that would take most of the day. "The mares?" she asked. "3 of them. They need water by noon. I can carry it." He looked at her. "It's cold." "I know what cold is," she said. He watched her for a moment, and then he said, "The yoke is in the small barn. The pails are by the east door." He started to leave. Then he stopped. "The gray mare bites if you come at her from the left. Right side," she said. "Got it." She spent the morning hauling water in the cold, back and forth across the hard ground in the kind of wind that doesn't so much blow as push, flat and steady, like a hand against your chest. She wore her heavy coat and a wool scarf that had seen better years, and she worked without hurrying, because hurrying and cold that sharp is how a person falls. She kept her center of gravity low and her steps deliberate, and she gave the gray mare the right side and let the mare smell her hand first, and the mare drank. Emmett came back at noon and found all 3 mares watered and the south paddock gate latched and Clara in the kitchen making soup. He stood in the kitchen doorway again. He had a habit of that, pausing at thresholds, taking stock. He took stock of her now, in the yellow lamplight, her hair coming loose from its pins, color in her cheeks from the cold. "The mares are good," he said. They were thirsty. She did not turn around. "Soup's in 20 minutes. He did not move from the doorway. Something shifted in his face, something small and private, like a door opening 1 inch and then being carefully held. "Thank you," he said. Clara tipped her head slightly. "Sit down, Emmett." It was the first time she had used his given name. He sat down without commenting on it. The trouble arrived in the form of a letter from the Harlow land and cattle bank, which Emmett read at the kitchen table after Will had gone to bed on a Thursday at the end of November. Clara was mending a shirt at the other end of the table. He read the letter once and then set it face down and stared at the wall the way Will sometimes stared at the wall. She did not ask him what it said. She kept mending. After a while he said, "They're calling the note. The bank, partial payment by the 1st of the year, or they start proceedings on the South Acres." She pulled her thread through. "How short are you?" He told her the number. She did not wince. She thought for a moment. "You run cattle," she said. "What about horses?" "For sale." "Some. The gray is 12. She's safe and strong, and she moves like she knows it. You could get good money for her in Harlow before the 1st. He looked at her. "She's the best animal in the barn." "Yes," Clara said. "That's why she'll sell." He turned that over. It was not what he had expected her to say. He had half expected her to offer sympathy, or silence, or some form of gentle reassurance that did not require him to do anything. Instead, she had looked at the problem from the same direction he had to look at it, which was straight on. "There's also the matter of the hay contract with Foster's spread," she said. "You're underpricing." "I looked at the figures in the ledger when I reorganized the pantry shelf. I hope that wasn't wrong of me." The ledger was sitting in the pantry? Under the cornmeal tin. He had nothing to say to that. He rubbed the back of his neck. "How much under?" she told him. He made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word. "Renegotiate in January," she said, "after the banknote is clear." She tied off her thread. "Foster needs your hay more than he'll admit. He lost his North Meadow to blight this summer. You're his only local option, and he knows it." Emmett looked at her across the table in the lamplight. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for once, and it was very still. "How do you know about hay contracts?" he said. "My father's ranch," she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 14. He nodded slowly. He picked up the letter from the bank and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Not in the fire, not under the salt crock, in his pocket where he could deal with it. "I'll take the gray to Harlow on Saturday," he said. She nodded. She folded her mending. "Clara," she looked up. He seemed to consider several things and leave most of them unsaid. What he settled on was, that was good thinking. It was not a grand statement. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of thing a man says when he has decided, quietly and without announcement, to start trusting someone. The moment came on the first Saturday of December, in the cold blue hour before full morning, and it came from Will. Emmett had been in the barn since before dawn, getting the gray ready for Harlow. Clara had risen with him without being asked. She had the coffee on and the bread started before the sky had any color in it, because she understood that a man selling his best animal to save his land did not need to leave home without a warm meal. She did not speak much. She moved around the kitchen in the lamplight with the efficient quiet of someone who had made peace with early mornings long ago. Will was supposed to be asleep. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him, the deliberate, careful tread of a child trying not to make noise, which always makes more noise than just walking normally. She turned from the stove. He came into the kitchen in his long johns and socks, his hair pressed flat on one side, blinking in the lamplight. "You should be in bed," she said. "I know." He stood there for a moment, looking at her. Then he crossed the kitchen, not toward the table but toward her, and he reached up and tugged very gently at the sleeve of her coat, which was hanging on the peg by the door where she always put it when she came in. She watched him. He took the coat off the peg. He folded it, not perfectly but carefully, the way a child folds something they want to treat right, and he carried it to the chair nearest the stove and laid it over the back so it would be warm when she put it on. Then he looked at her. "So you're not cold when you go out," he said. Clara stood very still. She had been in a lot of kitchens. She had cooked for indifferent people and for grateful people and for people who had never once thought about whether she was warm. She had worked hard for small acknowledgments her whole life and had learned not to need them. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily. She looked at the coat on the chair. She looked at Will. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, and her voice came out slightly lower than she meant it to. Will nodded very seriously, as though that settled something. He went to the table and climbed into his chair. "Can I have bread before he leaves?" "Yes," she said. "You can have bread." She did not see Emmett in the barn doorway. He had come in quietly to say the gray was ready, and he had stopped at the kitchen doorframe, and he had seen all of it. The folded coat, the chair near the stove, his son's careful, solemn face. He stood in the cold doorway with the barn smell still on him, and he watched his son hand the bread to Clara without being asked, watched her take it and say something too quiet to carry, watched Will lean slightly toward her the way children lean toward warmth. Emmett stood there for a long time. He had been waiting, without knowing it, for permission. Not permission to want something, he was too practical a man to wait for that. Permission to believe that this could actually be his, that the right person had come to his table and his land and his boy, and that the universe was not, on this occasion, preparing to take her back. Will had just given him that permission. He drove to Harlow and sold the gray mare for more than he had hoped, because he described her honestly and at length, and the buyer was a rancher from Casper who knew a good horse when he heard one. Emmett did not celebrate. He deposited the money with Harlow Land and Cattle Bank, got his receipt, and drove home. He did not go into the house right away. He put up the wagon and the horse and stood in the barn for a while in the particular way men stand in barns when they have something to think about, with one hand on a post and their eyes not focused on anything. Then he went inside. Clara was at the table with Will, going over his arithmetic. She looked up when Emmett came in, and he held up the bank receipt for a moment, and she gave a single nod. Will looked between them. "Good?" Will asked. "Good," Emmett said. He hung his coat and his hat. He washed his hands at the basin. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at the two of them with the arithmetic book between them and the lamplight on their bent heads, Will's dark, Clara's darker, and he said, "Will, go wash up for supper." Will went, clattering up the stairs with the ordinary noise of a boy who is not trying to be quiet. Emmett pulled out the chair across from Clara and sat down. He set his hands flat on the table. He was not a man who rehearsed speeches. He had spent the drive back trying to find the right words and discovered, as he usually did, that he did not have them. "I'd like to speak to Reverend Hale," he said, "before the end of the month. If you're willing." Clara looked at him without surprise. "I'm willing. It won't be fancy," he said. "I don't have much that's fancy." "I'm not a fancy woman," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "You're not." And by the way he said it, she understood that he had looked at who she actually was, her capable hands and her direct eyes and the way she warmed a coat by a stove for a boy who wasn't hers yet, and that what he meant by it was not a lesser thing. It was the highest thing he knew how to say. He pushed back from the table and went to the stove to check the fire, because he was a man who showed what he felt with his hands and his feet and the way he moved through a room, not with declarations. He added a log. He adjusted the damper. He turned back to the kitchen, and instead of going back to his chair, he went to the cabinet and got down the good tin of coffee, the one he saved for Sundays, and set it on the counter and started a fresh pot. Clara watched him. "The South Acres," he said, his back still to her. "I want to plant them in spring. I've been leaving them fallow because I didn't see the point." He paused. "I see the point now." She did not answer right away. She looked at the lamp flame and at the arithmetic book Will had left open, and at the window where the first real snow of December was beginning to come down soft and quiet in the dark. "What were you thinking?" she said. "For the South Acres." "Hay," he said. "More hay. If Foster's going to need supply for the next few years, I want to be in a position to set the terms." "Smart," she said. He finally turned around. He poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them to the table and sat back down, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the snow came down outside, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it just then. Will found out about Reverend Hale 3 days later, because Emmett told him over breakfast plainly, the way he told Will everything, because he had decided long ago that a boy deserved his father's honesty. "Miss Voss and I are going to get married," he said. "If that sits right with you." Will had a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. He looked at his father. He looked at Clara across the table. Clara looked back at him and waited. Will set the bread down. He thought about it for what felt like a long time, long enough that Emmett started to read things into it that may not have been there. Then Will said, "Can I call her Mama?" The kitchen went very quiet. Clara's hands were still on the table in front of her. She did not move them. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "You can call me that." Will picked up his bread again. "Okay," he said, with the air of a boy who has concluded a satisfactory negotiation, and took a bite. Emmett looked at the top of his son's head and then at Clara's face and found there something he had no name for, a brightness and a fullness that had nothing to do with happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but something quieter and more durable. The look of a person who had been standing in the cold for a long time without complaining about it and had just come inside. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They married on the 22nd of December in Reverend Hale's small church in Harlow, with no guests except old Mrs. Prentice, who played the hymns and forgot 2 of the verses and did not seem troubled by it. Will stood beside his father in his good jacket, the one his mother had taken in all those years ago, and he held the ring until Emmett needed it, and then handed it over with great seriousness, as though he had been preparing for this specific task his whole life. On the drive home, Will fell asleep against Clara's arm before they had cleared Harlow's last building. She did not shift away from the weight of him. She sat in the cold wagon with the stars very bright and close above the high plains, and Will's head warm and heavy on her shoulder, and Emmett beside her watching the dark road. It had snowed 2 inches while they were in the church. The ranch appeared through the trees the way it always did, low and solid against the hills, the barn lamp still burning amber in the window where Emmett had left it. She looked at it. She had ridden up to a lot of places in her life with her trunk in the back and her hands in her lap and the working question of whether she would stay. She had always known the answer fairly quickly. She knew it now. Emmett pulled up the team and set the brake. He climbed down and turned and put his arms up for Will without waking him, and lifted the boy out of the wagon and carried him toward the house, and Clara watched him go, this quiet, deliberate, faithful man carrying his son through the snow toward the lit door. She climbed down on her own and followed them in. She hung her coat on the peg by the door, the peg that was hers now, that had been hers since the morning Will had warmed the coat and set it on the chair, and she stood in the kitchen that was hers, in the house that was hers, on the land that was going to be planted with hay in the spring, and she listened to Emmett's boots on the stairs and the low creak of Will's bedroom door. The stove was still warm. She put a log in without thinking about it, the way you do things in a house you know. Emmett came back down and stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her in the kitchen with the lamplight on her face, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and neither of them needed to. Outside, the snow was still coming down, soft and patient, covering everything new.